Hello and welcome back. Before we begin, take a moment to make yourself comfortable. Set your volume to a gentle level, just enough for my voice to reach you without effort. Let your body sink into the bed. Feel the weight of the day slowly melting away. Close your eyes, let the world outside grow quiet, and simply be here. Tonight, we start the very first story in our Boring History for Sleep series. A calm journey through time, with no rush, no urgency, just a slow drift into rest. This is the slow spread of the spinning wheel. If you enjoy nights like this, I invite you to gently tap the like button, subscribe, and let us keep you company night after night. Now, let's begin. For much of human history, the work of turning loose fibers into strong, usable thread was a slow and deliberate task, carried out by patient hands with the aid of the simple drop spindle. In small cottages and shaded courtyards, people would twist fibers by hand, coaxing them into a long, thin strand, winding it steadily onto the spindle's shaft. This was a process as old as settled life itself, repeated for countless generations, producing the thread from which cloth was woven, garments were sewn, and daily life was dressed. It was labor that consumed hours each day, a quiet rhythm woven into the lives of spinners across many lands. The spinning wheel, that now familiar image from both history books and old tales, did not arrive suddenly into the world, but emerged slowly, almost shyly, from the steady march of necessity and invention. It is believed that the earliest form of the spinning wheel took shape in India, perhaps as early as the 11th century, though the exact moment and place remain lost to time. Unlike the spindle, which relied entirely on the spinner's hands to twist the fibers, the new device introduced a simple mechanical advantage: a large wheel connected to a spindle by a cord or band, which could be turned with one hand while the other guided the fibers. This allowed the spinner to maintain a continuous motion, producing a more even thread and working at a greater pace. At first, the change was subtle, and in many places, the old methods continued side by side with the new. The spinning wheel did not sweep instantly across continents. Travel was slow, and with it, the spread of ideas. Traders might carry stories of a new tool they had seen in a distant town. Travelers might bring back sketches or rough copies, but months, even years, could pass before such a thing took root in a new place. When the wheel began to appear in Persia, in China, and across parts of the Islamic world, it was often adapted to local materials and needs, sometimes crafted from wood, sometimes from a mix of wood and metal. In many villages, the arrival of a spinning wheel was an event, and yet it did not erase the spindle overnight. People trusted the old ways. They were cautious of change. Some considered the wheel unnecessary, believing the spindle gave them more control over the fineness of the thread. Others simply could not afford the cost of having a wheel built. And so the slow spread began, uneven and patient. It was not until centuries later that Europe encountered the spinning wheel, perhaps through trade routes linking the East to the Mediterranean. In some places, it appeared in its simplest form, operated by hand. In others, it evolved into more complex designs with treadles, allowing the spinner to work with both hands free. But in this earliest stage, the wheel was still something of a curiosity, seen in small numbers, often reserved for the households of wealthier weavers, or for communal workshops where several spinners might gather. The world into which the spinning wheel entered was one where time was measured differently, where a tool could take decades, even generations, to reach its full potential. And so, in these early centuries, the story of the spinning wheel is less about sudden transformation and more about quiet persistence, an invention that would wait patiently for the right hands, in the right place, at the right time, to give it life. As the centuries moved forward, the spinning wheel's gradual journey carried it across trade routes that wound through deserts, mountains, and busy coastal ports. Merchants, whose caravans were laden with silks, spices, and precious metals, occasionally carried with them tools and ideas that would spark quiet revolutions in distant lands. Among these, the spinning wheel found its place as both a curiosity and a practical device, though rarely did it travel in its completed form. More often, it arrived as a description, a sketch on a scrap of parchment, or the memory of how a craftsman's hands had shaped wood into something that could turn with such steady grace. When it reached new regions, it was reimagined according to the materials available. In some places, the frame was simple, the wheel small and light enough to carry under an arm, while in others it was larger, sturdier, meant to stay in a fixed corner of the home. This adaptability was part of the reason it persisted, though adoption remained uneven. Villages that relied heavily on weaving for trade or household needs often saw the wheel as a welcome improvement, while those whose economies were less tied to cloth were slower to embrace it. In the small towns of Persia and along the Silk Road, the wheel sometimes appeared in the hands of skilled spinners who demonstrated its use at markets, their fingers moving with the practiced ease that made the process seem almost magical. In China, records suggest it was adapted into horizontal designs, better suited to certain fibers and weaving styles, showing that invention was not a single fixed point, but a living thing that changed with each culture that touched it. And yet, for all its promise, the spinning wheel did not sweep away the old ways. The drop spindle, with its simplicity and portability, remained a trusted tool. There were practical reasons for this. A spindle could be used while walking, tending animals, or watching over children, making it an ideal companion for daily life. The wheel, by contrast, required a place to sit and work, a certain amount of space, and often a level of craftsmanship that not all communities could provide. As a result, its spread was shaped as much by geography and economy as by innovation. In some regions, it became a sign of modest prosperity, a household's investment in efficiency and skill. In others, it was almost ceremonial, used for special work such as preparing fine threads for garments of importance. When it did appear in Europe, likely sometime in the late Middle Ages, it was still a rare sight, its novelty making it an object of interest among those who worked with textiles. Early European wheels were often hand-driven, the spinner turning the wheel with one hand while guiding the fibers with the other, producing a rhythm that was steady, but not yet as efficient as it would later become. In the quiet interiors of cottages and workshops, the sound of the wheel was a low, soft hum, blending with the crackle of the hearth or the muted voices of others at work. It was not the clang of metalworking or the roar of a mill, but a gentler music, the sound of thread being born. This was the stage in the spinning wheel's life when it was still more a promise than a revolution, a tool that would wait patiently in the corner until its time truly came, when the forces of trade, craftsmanship, and necessity would finally align to bring it into the heart of textile production. By the 15th century, the spinning wheel had begun to take a firmer hold in parts of Europe, yet even then, its presence was far from universal, and its forms were varied depending on where it was made and used. In some regions, artisans favored the upright or great wheel design, where the spinner turned a large vertical wheel by hand while standing or sitting beside it, drawing out long fibers with practiced motions that looked almost like a slow, deliberate dance. In other areas, particularly in places where linen production was central, smaller and more compact versions of the wheel became common, their wooden frames polished smooth by years of touch, the wheel itself spinning with a steady, almost meditative rhythm. These early European spinning wheels still relied on hand power, but they represented a significant shift from the pure drop spindle method, allowing for longer stretches of continuous thread and greater consistency in thickness. The pace of production increased modestly, which for many households meant the difference between having just enough cloth for their own needs and being able to sell a surplus at market. Still, the wheel's spread remained uneven, shaped by local economies, cultural traditions, and even political boundaries. In certain rural areas, the old spindle held on as the favored tool simply because it could be carried anywhere, used while walking to fetch water or while sitting outdoors tending children or animals. The wheel, though more efficient in stationary settings, required a dedicated space indoors and the resources to acquire or build one. Skilled carpenters and wheelwrights sometimes made them to order, often as gifts for newlyweds or as a prized tool for a family's weaving tradition. The technology itself also began to evolve subtly as different communities experimented with changes to the wheel's size, the tensioning systems, and the placement of the spindle. Over time, these small adjustments would lead to the introduction of the treadle, a foot-operated pedal that freed both hands for spinning. But in these early days, the wheel was still turned by hand. In the quiet rooms where it was used, its gentle whir became part of the household soundscape, blending with the creak of wooden floors, the faint hiss of a kettle, or the muted conversations of family members working nearby. The spread of the spinning wheel was, in many ways, a mirror of the pace of life in this period, deliberate, unhurried, and bound closely to the rhythms of both necessity and tradition. It was never the kind of invention to spark immediate upheaval, but rather one that settled gradually into the daily life of those who found value in its steady, dependable work. Each new household that acquired a wheel joined an unbroken chain stretching back centuries, a quiet continuation of the slow transformation that would, in time, change the way cloth was made across much of the known world. As the spinning wheel found its place in more European households, it began to weave itself into the fabric of daily life in subtle but meaningful ways. In villages where long winters kept people indoors for months at a time, the wheel became a steady companion to the quiet work of making yarn, the spinner's hands moving in practiced harmony, while the large wooden wheel turned with a soft, repetitive sound that seemed to match the rhythm of breathing. The process was never hurried, for spinning was a task that rewarded patience, and each length of thread had to be smooth, even, and strong before it could be wound into skeins for weaving. Families who owned a wheel often found that it became more than just a tool. It was a marker of self-reliance, a sign that they could clothe themselves and perhaps even trade surplus yarn for other necessities. In some communities, spinning became a shared activity, with neighbors gathering together in one home during the colder months, each bringing their own fibers to work with, sharing news, stories, and songs as their wheels turned in unison. These gatherings, sometimes called spinning bees, were as much about companionship as they were about productivity, and the steady hum of the wheels created an atmosphere of gentle industry. At the same time, the spread of the wheel was influencing the work of weavers, for a more reliable supply of thread allowed them to produce cloth with fewer interruptions. Merchants took note of regions where yarn production had increased, and over time, certain areas became known for their spinning skill, drawing buyers from farther afield. Yet the spinning wheel's journey was still far from complete. In many remote areas, people continued to rely on the drop spindle, either out of habit, tradition, or because a wheel was still too costly or difficult to obtain. Even in towns where wheels were more common, not every household could afford one, and ownership sometimes reflected a family's standing within the community. The craft of wheel-making itself began to grow, with local carpenters learning the specific skills needed to shape the large, balanced wheel, the smooth spindle, and the sturdy frame that could endure years of use. Designs varied from one region to another, and though they shared the same basic function, a wheel from the German states might look quite different from one made in France or Italy. This slow diversification was part of the wheel's quiet evolution, a process shaped by local materials, cultural preferences, and the ingenuity of individual makers. And so, while the spinning wheel was still centuries away from the industrial changes that would one day transform textile production entirely, it was already laying the groundwork in these centuries of quiet, steady adoption. Each household that acquired a wheel became another small link in the long chain of its history, a history not of sudden leaps, but of patient, deliberate steps, moving slowly outward from its origins until, little by little, it would touch nearly every corner of the world where cloth was made. By the 16th century, the spinning wheel had settled more firmly into the rhythm of European life, though still with a measured, uneven presence depending on geography, wealth, and tradition. In regions with strong textile trades, such as the Low Countries, northern Italy, and parts of the German states, the wheel became a familiar sight in cottages and townhouses alike, often placed near a window where the light could fall on the spinner's hands during the short winter days. The wheel itself had become more refined, with smoother bearings, better balanced construction, and decorative touches that reflected the pride of its maker, turned spokes, carved motifs, and polished surfaces that glowed in the lamplight. Still, it remained a tool of quiet labor rather than spectacle, its purpose bound to the slow creation of thread, one continuous length at a time. The drop spindle, though gradually less dominant, was far from disappearing, especially in rural areas where mobility mattered and a portable tool was still the most practical choice. The contrast between the two methods shaped the texture of production, the wheel for steady, seated work indoors, the spindle for moments stolen between other tasks in the fields or along the lanes. In towns where spinning was part of a household's livelihood, the wheel became a vital piece of equipment, allowing for more consistent thread that fetched a better price at market. This reliability also encouraged specialization. Some families became known for producing especially fine yarn for high-quality linens or delicate wools, while others spun sturdier threads for everyday cloth. The slow spread of the spinning wheel was influenced as much by these small economic incentives as by the technology itself. It was also during this period that the early treadle-operated wheels began to appear, freeing both hands for the careful drafting of fibers and allowing for a smoother, more continuous spin. This innovation, though not instantly widespread, hinted at the future potential of the wheel and encouraged skilled spinners to experiment with their technique. In many households, the wheel was passed down from one generation to the next, its wooden frame carrying the marks of years of use, slight grooves where a spinner's fingers had rested, the faint polish from countless rotations of the drive wheel. Children often learn the skill by watching their elders, first twisting small tufts of fiber by hand, then practicing with a spindle, and eventually taking a place at the wheel itself. The craft was part of the fabric of life, an inheritance of skill as much as of the tool itself. And though the pace of its spread was still far from swift, the wheel's presence was beginning to create subtle ripples in the way communities thought about production and trade. More thread meant more cloth. More cloth meant the possibility of barter, of surplus, of reaching beyond the limits of a single village. The spinning wheel, without fanfare or sudden upheaval, was slowly becoming one of the quiet engines that kept households clothed, markets supplied, and the skills of textile making alive across an ever wider stretch of the map. By the 17th century, the spinning wheel had become an established presence in many parts of Europe, though it still moved at the same deliberate pace through the layers of society, never arriving all at once, never sweeping away the older methods entirely. In the countryside, where most people still lived, the wheel's adoption depended on the skill of local carpenters and the availability of suitable wood, often oak, ash, or beech, each carefully chosen for its strength and ability to withstand years of turning. In small towns and market centers, wheelmakers began to refine their designs, standardizing certain proportions so that replacement parts could be made more easily, though each still bore the subtle marks of the maker's hand. In homes, the wheel often stood in a place of quiet honor, positioned near the hearth or in a sunlit corner, ready to be set into motion during the long hours of winter evenings. The sound it made, a low, steady hum, was one of the defining tones of domestic life, a counterpoint to the crackle of the fire and the muffled chatter of family or neighbors. This was a period when the treadle-operated spinning wheel was gaining more ground, especially in regions where textile production was a significant part of the economy. The treadle freed the spinner's hands entirely, allowing for more precise control of the fibers and a smoother, more continuous yarn. This meant higher productivity without sacrificing quality, and for some families, it meant the difference between making enough to sell and simply meeting their own needs. In weaving towns, the relationship between spinners and weavers became more interdependent, the steady supply of good thread allowing looms to work without long pauses for yarn preparation. Still, the wheel did not replace every spindle. In mountainous regions, coastal fishing villages, and scattered farmsteads, the spindle remained the tool of choice, its portability and simplicity outweighing the advantages of the wheel for people who needed to spin on the move. The slow spread of the spinning wheel also reflected the rhythms of trade and travel. News of better designs might take months to reach a distant valley, and the materials to make them might take longer still. Yet bit by bit, the wheel's presence expanded, its form adapting to local needs, some with larger wheels for long staple fibers, others with smaller, lighter frames for easier handling. It became part of a shared visual language of work, appearing in paintings, household inventories, and even in folk songs that spoke of love, labor, and the turning of the seasons. In this way, the spinning wheel's journey was not simply a technological story, but a cultural one, woven into the lives of those who used it and passed it on. It was a tool that carried with it the quiet persistence of generations, its slow revolution mirroring the slow but steady changes of the societies it served. And though no one in those years could have imagined the vast machines that would one day take over the work of spinning, the wheel remained a symbol of skill, patience, and the intimate connection between human hands and the materials that clothed the world. By the 18th century, the spinning wheel had settled deeply into the domestic and economic life of many regions, though it still retained the quiet, unhurried presence it had always possessed. In larger towns and cities, where guilds regulated much of the textile trade, wheels were often built to a high standard, with finely turned spokes, smooth-moving treadles, and well-balanced drive wheels that could spin for long moments with just a gentle push. In rural homes, the designs were sometimes simpler, shaped from whatever wood was at hand, yet still functional enough to produce strong, even thread. The treadle wheel had become the preferred form in many areas, freeing the spinner's hands to manage fibers with precision and producing a rhythm of foot and hand that, once learned, could be sustained for hours without strain. In these years, spinning was not only a practical skill, but often a social one. Women gathered together in each other's homes, sometimes in the evenings after the day's farm work was done, to spin in company. The gatherings were filled with quiet conversation, the telling of local news, or the singing of soft, repetitive songs that seemed to match the steady turning of the wheel. These spinning circles were common in many cultures, a reflection of how deeply the craft was woven into the patterns of life. At the same time, the wheel's slow spread continued into regions that had once resisted it. In mountainous or isolated areas, the appearance of a spinning wheel might be a rare event, a gift from a traveling relative, or the work of a visiting craftsman who had learned the design elsewhere. Once introduced, it often took years before it became common, its adoption shaped by both practical needs and the subtle influences of fashion and status. The wheel also began to take on symbolic meaning in some places, appearing in art and literature as an emblem of diligence, domesticity, and the quiet industry of home life. In certain communities, a spinning wheel might be given as part of a bride's dowry, representing both the skill she brought to her new household and the expectation that she would contribute to its material well-being. The technology itself saw small refinements, better bearings, stronger tensioning systems, and more consistent spindles. But these changes came slowly, passed from one craftsman to another, and adopted only when they proved their worth over years of use. The world was still far from the industrial looms and spinning frames that would arrive in the century to come. Yet in the quiet workrooms of farmhouses, townhouses, and cottages, the spinning wheel was already laying the foundation for that transformation. Each turn of its wheel, each thread drawn smoothly from a handful of fibers, was part of a centuries-long story of adaptation, patience, and the enduring human desire to shape raw materials into something both useful and beautiful. And though the people of that time could not yet see the changes ahead, they knew the satisfaction of work done well, the comfort of self-reliance, and the familiar sound of the wheel turning steadily through the seasons, marking time in its own gentle way. As the 18th century moved toward its close, the spinning wheel remained an integral part of household life in many regions, even as whispers of new machines and methods began to travel along the same trade routes that had once carried the wheel itself. In villages and towns, the wheel's presence was so familiar that it was easy to forget how transformative it had once been. Its wooden frame, often worn smooth by decades of use, might stand in the same spot year after year, by the hearth in winter or near an open window in summer, ready for the spinner to sit and resume the work as naturally as breathing. The process itself had changed little: the careful drawing of fibers, the precise coordination of hands and feet, the quiet concentration needed to produce a thread that was both strong and even. In many households, spinning was still a shared skill, passed from mother to daughter, aunt to niece, grandmother to granddaughter, ensuring that the craft endured across generations. The gatherings where women spun together remained common, providing a space for companionship, the exchange of news, and the telling of stories that blended memory, tradition, and imagination. In some areas, these gatherings took on a more organized form, with certain nights of the week set aside for community spinning, the steady hum of multiple wheels creating a low, soothing chorus that filled the room. The wheel itself had become a symbol of continuity, a bridge between past and present, linking the memory of ancestors who had spun by spindle to the present moment, where treadles and spindles worked in quiet partnership. Small innovations appeared here and there: improved flyers that made the winding of yarn onto the bobbin more efficient, better quality drive bands that reduced slippage, and refined woodwork that balanced durability with elegance. But these changes were absorbed slowly, folded into the long tradition rather than replacing it overnight. In rural economies where textile production was essential, the spinning wheel allowed families to keep pace with demand, making it possible to contribute to local markets or to barter goods beyond their immediate needs. Even in regions where the first signs of mechanization began to appear, the wheel held its ground, valued for its independence from the large, expensive machinery that required significant investment and often centralized production in mills. For many, the wheel represented not just a tool for making thread, but a way of maintaining control over their labor and their time, a quiet assertion of self-sufficiency in an era when the nature of work was beginning to shift. The slow spread that had characterized the wheel's history was still evident. There were parts of the world where it had yet to appear, and others where it had arrived but remained rare, treasured as much for its rarity as for its usefulness. Its journey was far from over, and though no one could know it, the spinning wheel was nearing a turning point, a moment when the steady hum of its wooden frame would meet the roar of new industrial machines. Yet even then, in the decades to come, the wheel would not vanish entirely. It would remain in homes, in workshops, and in the quiet corners of history, a reminder of an age when progress moved not in sudden leaps, but in the slow, deliberate turning of a wheel. By the dawn of the 19th century, the spinning wheel found itself in a world on the edge of great change. For centuries, it had been the trusted companion of countless households, its gentle turning a symbol of patient, skillful labor, yet now it stood alongside the first signs of industrial transformation. In some regions, large mechanized spinning frames and powered looms began to appear in mills, their clattering speed a sharp contrast to the quiet hum of a home wheel. These new machines could produce far greater quantities of thread in a fraction of the time. And in towns where factories took root, the spinning wheel's role began to shift. In rural areas, however, life moved at a slower pace, and the wheel remained essential. There, its spread continued in the same gradual fashion it always had, carried by itinerant craftsmen, gifted as part of wedding dowries, or purchased at local fairs from wheel makers who had learned their trade from the generations before them. In these places, the wheel still held its central place by the hearth, the light from the fire catching the smooth arc of its rim as the treadle worked steadily underfoot. For many, spinning at home was not only a necessity, but a comfort, a familiar rhythm that could be kept through the seasons, a skill that ensured the household's self-reliance regardless of distant market forces. Even as industrial goods began to trickle into rural markets, there remained a pride in producing one's own thread, knowing its quality and knowing the care that had gone into every strand. The craft continued to be taught to young girls and, in some households, to boys as well, passing along not just a skill, but an understanding of patience, coordination, and the value of quiet, consistent work. In some communities, spinning circles persisted, though the conversation began to change. Talk of mills, wages, and the new machines wove itself into the stories told beside the wheel, marking the slow encroachment of industrial life. Yet the wheel did not vanish. It adapted, sometimes serving as a supplementary tool for households that also purchased machine-made cloth, sometimes becoming more of a ceremonial or symbolic object, displayed with pride as a reminder of family heritage. In certain parts of the world, particularly in colonies and remote settlements, the spinning wheel arrived for the first time during this period, carried across oceans and continents, its usefulness undiminished in places far from the reach of steam-powered industry. The wheel's design had reached a point of quiet perfection, sturdy enough to last for decades, simple enough to be repaired locally, and graceful enough to be as pleasing to look at as it was to use. In these early years of the century, no one could say with certainty how long the wheel would endure in daily life, but for those who sat beside it, guiding fiber into thread with steady hands, it remained what it had always been, a trusted companion in the endless work of clothing the world, turning slowly, patiently, one revolution at a time. As the 19th century unfolded and the Industrial Revolution gathered its full force, the spinning wheel's long, measured journey through history began to take on a different shape. In the great textile centers, vast factory floors filled with rows of spinning frames powered by steam engines churned out thread at a pace no hand-operated wheel could match, their relentless motion producing miles of yarn in the time it once took a skilled spinner to fill a single bobbin. For many urban households, the wheel faded quietly from daily life, replaced by store-bought cloth that was cheaper and quicker to obtain. Yet in the quieter stretches of the world, rural valleys, mountain hamlets, small island communities, the wheel's story continued much as it had for centuries. Here, it remained an everyday tool, relied upon to turn wool, flax, and cotton into thread for clothing, bedding, and trade. Its construction changed little, for the design had reached a state of elegant simplicity that needed no further refinement. The broad rim of the wheel turning in harmony with the rise and fall of the treadle, the spindle and flyer working together to draw fibers into a strong, even twist. In these places, the spinning wheel retained its symbolic weight as well, a representation of diligence, self-sufficiency, and the link between generations. It often stood in the same spot year after year, its wood darkened by time, the marks of countless hands visible on its smooth surfaces. Grandmothers would teach their granddaughters to spin, just as they had been taught, ensuring that even in an age of machines, the skill did not vanish entirely. In some cultures, the wheel even became an emblem of political and social movements. Most famously, in India, it emerged as a symbol of self-reliance and resistance during the struggle for independence, a reminder that one could clothe a nation without relying on foreign mills. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the spinning wheel was no longer a necessity, in much of the industrialized world, but it was far from forgotten. It lived on in cottage industries, in the work of craftspeople dedicated to traditional methods, in museums and exhibitions where its history was told to new generations. Even in homes where it was no longer used, it might stand quietly in a corner, a piece of family heritage too meaningful to discard. In this way, the slow spread of the spinning wheel had reached its natural conclusion, not with a sudden end, but with a gradual blending into history, its role shifting from vital household tool to treasured artifact and cultural symbol. It had traveled across continents and centuries, adapting to countless local needs and materials, shaping the way people clothed themselves, and leaving behind not just thread and cloth, but a story of patience, ingenuity, and the enduring human capacity to take what is at hand and make from it something lasting. And so, in the great tapestry of human history, the spinning wheel remains a quiet, steady thread, turning still in the memory of those who know the sound of its hum and the feel of its wheel beneath their hand. English transition script. That brings us to the end of our previous story. Before we drift into the next one, I'd be so grateful if you could give this video a gentle like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep bringing you these calm, quiet journeys through history. Now, let's settle in once more, keep the volume soft, and let your mind relax as we begin the next story in our Boring History for Sleep series. The slow spread of the spinning wheel. For much of human history, the work of turning loose fibers into strong, usable thread was done slowly, by steady hands using the simple drop spindle, a tool so ancient that it predates written history. In fields, cottages, and courtyards, people twisted plant fibers or animal hair into long, even strands, winding them carefully onto a spindle, building the thread that would become cloth, clothing, and the many fabrics that shape daily life. This work could not be rushed, for the quality of the thread depended on the consistency of the twist, the steadiness of the hands, and the patience of the spinner. For centuries, the spindle was enough, a tool that could be carried anywhere, worked on while walking, tending animals, or sitting with others. Then slowly, in the distant past, a new idea began to take shape, one that would eventually change the rhythm of spinning forever. The spinning wheel, a device that could turn continuously, allowing the spinner to work with greater speed and consistency, is thought to have first appeared in India, perhaps as early as the 11th century, though the exact time and place remain uncertain. Instead of relying entirely on the fingers to twist the fiber, the spinning wheel used a large rotating wheel connected by a cord to a spindle, so that one hand could turn the wheel while the other guided the fiber. This allowed for a smooth, continuous motion, producing thread more quickly and with less interruption. At first, this invention spread slowly, traveling not as a finished tool, but as an idea, carried by merchants and travelers along trade routes that wound across deserts, through mountains, and into new lands. In each place it reached, it was adapted to local materials, sometimes built entirely from wood, sometimes with small metal parts to strengthen the mechanism. Early versions were simple, with the spinner turning the wheel by hand, but even this modest improvement offered a new rhythm, one that could transform hours of stop-and-start work into a more flowing process. Still, the drop spindle did not disappear overnight. In many regions, people were cautious about change, and for some, the spindle's portability and familiarity outweighed the wheel's advantages. In other places, the cost of building a wheel or the difficulty of finding a craftsman skilled enough to make one slowed its spread. Yet the idea persisted, passing quietly from one region to another, finding its way into workshops, markets, and homes. The spinning wheel was not a sudden revolution, but a slow, steady shift, one that would take centuries to reach the far corners of the world. And in its earliest days, it remained a curiosity in many places, a promising tool still rare, waiting for the right conditions to become a part of everyday life. As the idea of the spinning wheel slowly moved along the trade routes of the medieval world, it began to take root in new regions, each adapting the design to suit their own needs and resources. In Persia, it appeared in small workshops where fine threads were needed for delicate textiles, the kind used in luxurious garments and elaborate tapestries. Craftsmen there refined the wooden frame, adding subtle curves to strengthen the structure, while making it more graceful to the eye. In China, the spinning wheel took on a horizontal form, a design better suited to certain local fibers and weaving styles, allowing the spinner to sit comfortably while drawing out long, even threads. Across the Islamic world, versions of the wheel began to appear in homes and market stalls, sometimes compact and easily portable, sometimes larger and meant to remain in one place. In each culture, the spinning wheel was both a familiar concept, twisting fiber into thread, and an unfamiliar tool, something that required learning new rhythms and motions. The transition from the drop spindle to the wheel was not automatic, for many people were deeply skilled with the older method, able to spin while walking, tending animals, or doing other tasks. The wheel, by contrast, required the spinner to sit in wuotam on one place, focusing both hands and often one foot on the work. For some, this was an improvement, a way to produce more thread in less time. For others, it seemed less practical in a life filled with constant movement. This is why, even as the spinning wheel spread, the spindle endured, the two tools existing side by side for centuries. The speed of adoption also depended on local economies. In areas where weaving and textile production were central to trade, the wheel offered a clear advantage, making it easier to keep up with demand. In more isolated or self-sufficient communities, where only small amounts of cloth were needed, the wheel was slower to appear. Still, it was carried forward, not only by merchants, but by migrants, artisans, and even gifts exchanged between rulers, each introduction adding another small link in the chain of its spread. By the time the spinning wheel began to make its way toward Europe, it had already taken on many forms, each shaped by the hands and habits of those who built and used it. In these early centuries of its journey, the wheel was not yet a symbol of the past, as it might seem today, but a new and promising technology, one that would, in time, become as familiar to the households of the world as the spindle it had begun to accompany. By the 15th century, the spinning wheel had begun to take its first careful steps into Europe, arriving through a combination of overland trade routes and maritime connections that linked the Mediterranean to the east. It did not appear everywhere at once, nor did it immediately replace older spinning practices. Instead, it found its way into select workshops and households, often in towns where textile production was already a well-established craft. Early European wheels were typically of the great wheel variety, a large upright frame with a sizable wooden wheel turned by hand, the spinner standing or sitting beside it, drafting long fibers in measured motions that required both precision and rhythm. This design allowed for longer lengths of thread to be spun in a single motion compared to the spindle, and the wheel's smooth turning created a more even twist in the yarn. Yet, like in the East, adoption was gradual. The drop spindle was still deeply ingrained in daily life. Its portability, simplicity, and minimal cost made it the ideal companion for people who needed to spin while moving from task to task. For many rural households, the idea of dedicating space indoors to a large, stationary wheel was impractical. and so the two methods coexisted, each serving its own purpose. Where the wheel did take hold, it quickly became valued for its efficiency in stationary settings, particularly in towns where weaving was a significant trade. In these places, more consistent yarn production meant fewer interruptions for weavers, allowing them to produce cloth at a steadier pace. The skill of wheel making also began to take root, with carpenters and joiners learning to craft frames that were sturdy, balanced, and smooth turning. Wheels became not just tools, but also items of quiet craftsmanship, often with small decorative touches carved into the wood, reflecting the pride of both maker and owner. Over time, regional variations began to appear. A wheel built in Italy might look quite different from one in England or the German states, each reflecting local preferences and available materials. In the dim light of cottages, the wheel's gentle hum became part of the soundscape of home, blending with the crackle of the hearth and the soft murmur of conversation. The spinner's work was unhurried, each length of fiber carefully drawn out and twisted, wound onto the spindle in an endless repetition that could fill the hours of a long winter evening. Though still far from universal, the spinning wheel was now firmly on its path toward becoming a central part of Europe's domestic and economic life, its slow spread continuing with the same quiet persistence that had carried it across continents. As the 16th century unfolded, the spinning wheel's presence in Europe deepened, yet its spread still followed the measured rhythm that had defined its journey since its earliest days. In regions where textile production formed a core part of the economy, such as Flanders, northern Italy, and parts of the German states, the wheel was no longer a novelty, but an expected tool in the homes of skilled spinners. In these towns, it was common to see wheels placed near windows during daylight hours, so that the spinner could work by natural light, guiding the fibers with practiced fingers as the wheel turned steadily beside them. The great wheel remained the dominant form in many areas, operated by hand and used primarily for spinning long fibers like wool, but new variations began to appear. Smaller, more compact wheels, sometimes called Saxony wheels, emerged, designed to be used while seated, with a treadle allowing the spinner to keep both hands free for drafting. This change in design represented a significant leap in comfort and efficiency, though like all aspects of the wheel's history, its adoption was gradual and uneven. Rural communities often clung to the drop spindle, not out of resistance to innovation, but because it fit seamlessly into their way of life. A spindle could be carried into the fields, to market, or on long walks, while a wheel required a fixed space and dedicated time. Still, in households where weaving was common, the wheel offered advantages too great to ignore, producing more thread with greater consistency, and making it possible to weave larger quantities of cloth without long delays. The craftsmanship of wheel making also flourished during this time. Carpenters, wheelwrights, and joiners refined their techniques, producing wheels that were both sturdy and elegant, often embellished with turned wood details or simple carvings that reflected local styles. The materials varied, oak and beech in some regions, softer woods in others, but all were chosen for their balance of strength and workability. As the wheel spread, it began to weave itself into the cultural fabric as well as the economic one. It appeared in paintings, often as a quiet backdrop to domestic scenes, a visual shorthand for industry and diligence. It found a place in folk songs and proverbs, symbolizing patience, steady labor, and the turning of life's seasons. Yet for all these cultural associations, its role remained deeply practical. In the soft glow of lamplight or by the flicker of the hearth, spinners across Europe continued the same patient work that had defined their craft for generations, now aided by a tool that, while simple in its mechanics, carried within it the ingenuity and adaptability of countless hands and minds. And though the industrial age was still centuries away, the spinning wheel was already laying the foundation for a world where textiles could be produced on a scale far beyond the limits of any single household. By the 17th century, the spinning wheel had established itself as an essential presence in many European households, yet its journey remained marked by the same deliberate pace that had carried it from its distant origins. In prosperous weaving towns, the wheel was a common sight, positioned in warm corners of living rooms or workrooms, where the light from the fire or a sunlit window could fall across the spinner's hands. The great wheel, tall and upright, was still in use for long fibers, but the more compact treadle-operated wheels had begun to take hold, their design allowing for both hands to remain free while the feet provided the steady turning power. This innovation made spinning less tiring over long hours and allowed for greater precision in drafting the fibers, resulting in finer and more consistent threads. In rural areas, adoption continued more slowly, with many still relying on the drop spindle for its portability and familiarity, but even here, the wheel's influence was felt. A family who owned a spinning wheel often enjoyed a certain advantage, able to produce more yarn for weaving or for sale at market, and this surplus could be traded for other goods. Wheel making had also become its own small craft industry, with artisans learning to shape and balance the wooden wheel so that it spun smoothly and quietly for years on end. Some wheels were simple and functional, built quickly to meet demand, while others were finely crafted, with turned spokes, carved legs, and polished surfaces that reflected their maker's pride. In some households, the wheel became a treasured possession, passed from one generation to the next, its wood worn smooth where countless hands had guided it over decades of use. The sound of the wheel, the gentle hum of the rim, the soft whir of the spindle became part of the daily life of many homes, a background rhythm to conversations, songs, and the crackle of the hearth. In certain regions, spinning remained a communal activity, with neighbors gathering during the long winter months to work side by side, their wheels creating a soft chorus as stories and news passed between them. The wheel spread was also encouraged by the slow but steady expansion of trade, which carried both the tool itself and the fabrics it helped create to new markets. Yet despite its growing presence, the spinning wheel was still far from universal. There were corners of the continent where it was a rare sight, and others where it was entirely unknown. Its progress was determined as much by geography, local custom, and available materials as by the inherent advantages of the design. And so, even as Europe moved toward greater interconnection and trade, the spinning wheel continued its quiet expansion in the same manner it always had, patiently, steadily, one household at a time, weaving itself into the fabric of daily life without haste, but with the certainty of something too useful and too enduring to be left behind. By the early 18th century, the spinning wheel had reached a point where its design and function were well understood in many parts of Europe, yet its spread still carried the same measured quality that had marked its journey for hundreds of years. The treadle-operated wheel had become the preferred choice in regions where spinning was done for both household needs and commercial trade, allowing spinners to work for long stretches with less physical strain and with greater control over the fineness of the yarn. In towns known for their weaving traditions, the steady hum of wheels could be heard from multiple homes, the rhythmic tapping of treadles blending with the faint murmur of conversation and the occasional creak of a floorboard. Wheel-making itself had evolved into a specialized craft, with skilled artisans able to create perfectly balanced wheels that turned with almost no resistance, the smooth rotation making the work quieter and more efficient. These craftsmen often left their own subtle marks on their creations, small carvings, distinctive turning patterns, or decorative motifs that made each wheel unique while still adhering to the practical requirements of the design. In rural communities, where resources were scarcer and the pace of life slower, wheels were often simpler, built from locally available woods and sometimes assembled with parts that had been repaired or replaced over decades. Despite the differences in style and refinement, all shared the same essential function: to turn loose fibers into strong, continuous thread that could be woven into cloth. The wheel's role in daily life was deeply ingrained by this time, so much so that it appeared in paintings and literature as a symbol of patience, industry, and the quiet diligence of the home. In some places, a spinning wheel was considered an important part of a young woman's dowry, not only as a practical tool, but as a sign of readiness to contribute to the household's economy. Seasonal rhythms often dictated the pace of work. Wool spun in the winter months might be woven into cloth in the spring, while flax harvested in summer would be processed and spun as the days grew shorter. Even with the gradual emergence of more advanced machinery in certain industrial centers, the spinning wheel held its place, especially in regions far from the reach of early factories. It was valued for its independence, requiring no more than human skill, some basic maintenance, and the raw materials to keep producing. Its presence in homes reinforced the idea that self-sufficiency was both practical and honorable. And in this way, It maintained its relevance even as whispers of industrial change began to travel along the same routes that had once carried the wheel itself. The 18th century may have been a period of refinement rather than reinvention for the spinning wheel, but it was also a time when the wheel was perhaps at the height of its quiet influence, a trusted companion to countless households, turning steadily through the years as life outside moved at its own, equally deliberate pace. By the middle of the 18th century, the spinning wheel had reached a point of quiet maturity in much of Europe, its form and function so familiar that it was woven seamlessly into the rhythm of daily life. In towns where textile production formed a vital part of the local economy, the sight of a wheel in motion was as ordinary as the sight of bread baking or water being drawn from a well. The treadle-operated wheel had become the most widely used form in these areas, its design refined through generations of craftsmen who understood the subtle balance between form and function, weight and stability. The wheel's rim turned in a smooth, unbroken motion, the flyer and spindle working in harmony, as the spinner's hands drafted the fibers with practiced precision. In some households, the wheel was polished until the wood gleamed softly in the light, its carved details and turned spokes speaking of the care invested in its making. In others, the wheel bore the marks of long and heavy use, faint grooves where hands had rested, a slight shine where feet had pressed the treadle thousands of times. Spinning was still, for many, a communal and social activity. Neighbors gathered in each other's homes during the darker months, bringing baskets of fiber and working side by side, while sharing news, songs, and the comfort of a familiar company. In rural areas, where isolation was common and winters long, the wheel was a constant companion, its steady hum providing a quiet counterpoint to the crackle of the hearth. By this time, the wheel had also spread to new corners of the globe, carried aboard ships bound for distant colonies or overland by traders and settlers. In these far-off places, the wheel often had to be adapted to new conditions, different climates, different available woods, different cultural approaches to textile making. But its essential design proved remarkably resilient. While early industrial innovations were beginning to appear in certain centers of production, the reach of these machines was still limited, and the home spinning wheel remained the primary method of producing yarn for countless households. It was not simply a tool of work, but also a thread that tied generations together, with skills and techniques passed from elders to the young, ensuring the continuity of a craft that had already endured for centuries. The spinning wheel's slow spread was still ongoing, moving in the same deliberate fashion it always had, one home, one workshop, one community at a time. In a world that was beginning to change in ways few could yet predict, the wheel remained a steady and familiar presence, a quiet anchor to tradition amid the gradual currents of transformation. As the 18th century moved into its later decades, the spinning wheel remained a fixture in households across Europe and beyond, quietly holding its place even as the first faint signs of industrial change began to stir in certain corners of the textile world. In small villages, the wheel's gentle hum was as much a part of the soundscape as the chirping of birds in summer or the muffled hush of snow in winter, its presence so constant that few stopped to consider the centuries of travel and adaptation that had brought it into their homes. The treadle-operated wheel was now common in most places where spinning was done regularly, its balance and efficiency making it an ideal companion for long hours of work. The design by this time had reached a state of practical perfection, simple enough to be repaired with basic tools, yet refined enough to produce smooth, even yarn without great physical strain. The wheel's frame, whether plain and functional or decorated with carved details, was built to endure, often lasting through several generations of spinners. In some families, the same wheel that a grandmother had used in her youth might still be in daily service, the treadle worn smooth by decades of use, the wheel's rim still turning with the same steady grace it had when first built. Spinning circles and communal gatherings continued to play an important role in keeping the craft alive, offering both companionship and the sharing of techniques. In these settings, experienced spinners could pass on subtle skills: how to judge the twist of a thread by touch, how to prepare fibers so they drafted smoothly, how to keep a wheel running quietly for hours on end. The wheel's spread had also reached new lands through the expansion of trade and colonization. finding its way into remote settlements where it was often one of the few tools linking people to the wider world of textile production. In these places, it sometimes took on added symbolic value, representing self-reliance and the ability to provide for one's family without depending entirely on goods from distant markets. Even as more advanced machinery began to appear in urban textile centers, the wheel's role in rural and domestic settings remained largely unchallenged, for it offered a degree of independence that no factory could match. It was a tool that required no fuel beyond human effort, no infrastructure beyond the skill of the spinner and the availability of raw fiber. The slow spread of the spinning wheel, so patient and persistent, had ensured that by the end of the 18th century it was present in countless corners of the world, each wheel carrying with it not only the function for which it was built, but also the weight of a long, quiet history. A history spun, like the threads it created, from patience, skill, and the steady turning of a circle. By the turn of the 19th century, the spinning wheel stood at a quiet crossroads in its long history. For while it remained an indispensable part of life in countless homes, the first true wave of industrial textile machinery was beginning to emerge in a few regions, signaling a transformation that would eventually reach even the most remote valleys and hamlets. In cities like Manchester, Leeds, and parts of the Low Countries, large mechanized spinning frames powered by water or steam began to produce yarn, in volumes that no home wheel could match. Their clattering, relentless rhythm, a stark contrast to the gentle hum of a treadle in a cottage corner. Yet in rural Europe, in colonial settlements, and across much of the non-industrialized world, the wheel still reigned supreme, its simplicity and independence keeping it relevant even in the face of new technology. In these places, the spinning wheel was not merely a tool, but a trusted companion, one that required no costly infrastructure, no fuel beyond the steady motion of hands and feet, and no maintenance beyond occasional oiling and careful handling. Its spread continued in the same patient way it always had, carried into new lands by migrating families, gifted to newlyweds, or passed down from one generation to the next. The wheel's design, perfected over centuries, needed little alteration. Whether plain and functional or adorned with decorative carvings, it remained a masterpiece of balance and efficiency. In many households, the same wheel had seen decades of service, its wooden parts smoothed and darkened by time, its treadle worn into a gentle curve by countless hours of use. Spinning was still often a social activity, particularly in long winter months when neighbors gathered for evening spinning circles, exchanging news and sharing songs as the wheels turned steadily around them. In colonies and frontier settlements, the wheel took on special significance as a symbol of self-reliance, ensuring that even far from established markets, families could clothe themselves and produce goods for trade. Though the Industrial Revolution was gathering strength, its reach was not yet universal, and for millions, the spinning wheel remained the heart of textile production. It was part of the daily rhythm, part of the visual and auditory backdrop of life, part of the link between generations. Its slow spread over the centuries had not been a flaw, but a strength, allowing it to adapt to countless cultures, climates, and economies. And so, even as new machines began to define the future, the spinning wheel continued to hold its place in the present, its wooden rim turning steadily, its flyer spinning threads as it had for hundreds of years, marking time not in minutes or hours, but in the gentle, unbroken revolutions that connected the work of the hands to the fabric of life. As the 19th century progressed, the spinning wheel began to move slowly from being an everyday necessity to becoming a symbol of tradition, heritage, and self-reliance. Yet in many parts of the world, it still remained an active part of daily life. The great industrial textile mills in Britain, France, and parts of Europe were producing yarn and cloth in unprecedented quantities, their vast machinery driven by steam or water power. Yet these marvels of industry were still confined to urban centers and required significant investment, making them inaccessible to small households and isolated communities. In rural areas, on distant farms, in colonial settlements, and in regions far from industrial hubs, the spinning wheel continued its steady work as it had for centuries. Families still gathered in the soft light of morning or the quiet glow of evening to spin wool, flax, or cotton, the wheel's hum blending with the gentle sounds of home. the murmur of conversation, the occasional creak of the floorboards, the faint scent of wood smoke drifting from the hearth. For many, the wheel's presence was more than practical. It was a thread connecting generations, a tangible link to the skills, patience, and care of those who had come before. Some wheels, handed down through families, carried decades of history in the smoothness of their treadles and the darkened sheen of their wood, each mark and polish a reminder of the hands that had worked them. In certain cultures, the wheel took on political and symbolic significance. Most famously in India, it became a powerful emblem of self-sufficiency and resistance against colonial economic control, reminding people that they could produce their own cloth without relying on imported goods. In Europe and North America, as industrial textiles became more affordable and widespread, the wheel's role in production gradually diminished. Yet it remained cherished by those who valued the art of hand spinning and the satisfaction of creating something with care and skill. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the spinning wheel was as likely to be found in a place of honor in the home or in a museum as it was to be found in active daily use. Yet it never disappeared entirely. Cottage industries, artisan spinners, and rural households kept the tradition alive, ensuring that the knowledge and craft would not be lost. Its slow spread over the centuries had carried it across continents, adapting to countless environments and cultures. And even as the world moved toward mass production, the wheel's story remained one of patience, endurance, and quiet persistence. Today, it stands as both a tool and a symbol, an enduring reminder of a time when the making of cloth was a deeply personal, human-centered act, and when the steady turning of a wheel was enough to clothe a household, sustain a livelihood, and weave the threads of history together, one gentle revolution at a time. That brings us to the end of our previous story. Before we drift into the next one, I'd be so grateful if you could give this video a gentle like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue bringing you these calm, quiet journeys through history. Now, let's settle in once more. Keep the volume soft, let your body rest, and allow your mind to relax as we begin the next story in our Boring History for Sleep series, What It Took to Bind a Book in the 1400s. In the 15th century, when books were rare and precious objects, the process of binding a single volume was an undertaking of patience, skill, and careful craftsmanship, far removed from the mechanized efficiency we know today. A finished book was not simply a container for words. It was a physical embodiment of time, labor, and resources that began long before the binding itself. The pages, often made from sheets of parchment or vellum, were prepared with meticulous care, the skins cleaned, stretched, scraped, and dried until they were smooth and durable. These sheets were then folded into gatherings, or quires, each one containing several leaves, and these quires would be sewn together by hand using strong linen thread. The sewing alone could take hours, even days, depending on the size of the manuscript, and it was done with precision to ensure that the book would open and close smoothly for centuries to come. The binding process required more than just sewing. It involved building a protective structure around the text that could endure constant handling. Wooden boards, often made from oak or beech, were cut to size and shaped to fit the sewn pages. These boards would serve as the covers, their thickness and strength offering protection against moisture, pests, and physical wear. The spine of the book was reinforced with cords or bands, onto which the quires had been sewn, and these cords were then laced through channels carved into the boards to anchor the text securely in place. Covering the boards was another step that demanded skill. Leather was most common, often calfskin, goatskin, or pigskin, each with its own qualities of texture and durability. The leather would be soaked, stretched, and carefully glued over the boards, smoothed and pressed so that it adhered without wrinkles or bubbles. Decorative elements might be added at this stage: blind tooling, in which heated metal stamps were pressed into the leather to create patterns, or in the case of more luxurious volumes, gilding, where thin sheets of gold leaf were applied to create shimmering designs that caught the light. Clasps and metal fittings were also common, not merely decorative but functional, helping to keep the book tightly closed to protect the pages from warping. Each of these steps required not only specialized tools, but also a deep understanding of materials. For a binder in the 1400s had to judge by touch, sight, and experience how to prepare every component so that the finished work would last for generations. There was no rushing the process. Every stage, from folding and sewing to covering and finishing, was done with deliberate care, often in workshops that smelled of leather, wood shavings, and glue. In this way, the binding of a book was as much an act of devotion as it was a craft, producing an object that was not only functional, but also a work of art in its own right, worthy of the precious words it contained. Once the leather had been carefully drawn over the wooden boards and allowed to dry, the binder's attention turned to the finer details that would both strengthen and embellish the book. In the workshops of the 1400s, these final touches were not afterthoughts but essential parts of the process, for a well-bound book was expected to endure decades, even centuries, of handling. One of the most common reinforcements was the addition of headbands, small decorative bands of silk, linen, or hemp thread sewn at the top and bottom of the spine. These headbands served a practical purpose, helping to stabilize the spine and prevent the pages from pulling away under the strain of frequent opening. But they also offered an opportunity for subtle beauty. Often, binders would alternate colored threads in intricate patterns, creating a fine braid that could be glimpsed whenever the book was opened. The edges of the pages might also be treated at this stage. In many cases, they were simply trimmed smooth with a sharp blade. But for more valuable books, the edges could be gilded with gold leaf or painted in rich pigments, sometimes with delicate patterns or marbled designs that turned the edge of the book into a hidden work of art. Clasps and fittings were another significant step. These were usually made of brass or iron and attached with small nails or rivets to the covers. Their primary function was to keep the book tightly closed when not in use, protecting the parchment or vellum from humidity that could cause it to warp, but they also added a visual element that signaled the book's value. Some clasps were simple and functional, others were elaborately shaped, engraved, or even inlaid with enamel. Inside the book, the paste downs, the sheets of paper or parchment glued to the inner sides of the covers, were often added last. These served both to hide the lacing of the cords into the boards and to add another layer of stability to the structure. In some bindings, the paste downs were plain and utilitarian, while in others they were decorated with printed patterns, hand-painted designs, or even fragments of older manuscripts recycled from other books. The final inspection was an important part of the process. The binder would check the alignment of the pages, the tightness of the sewing, the adhesion of the leather, and the smooth operation of the clasps. If any element was out of place, adjustments were made before the book left the workshop. Every stage of this work required patience and a practiced hand, for mistakes could be costly and difficult to repair. In an age when each book represented a significant investment of materials and labor, the binder's role was not just mechanical but deeply responsible, safeguarding the words contained within by giving them a form that would last. The result was a finished object that blended strength, beauty, and utility, an enduring testament to the craftsmanship of its maker and a reminder that in the 1400s, binding a book was as much about creating a legacy as it was about making a functional item. With the structure of the book complete, the final stages of binding in the 1400s often involved adding elements that gave the volume its unique personality. For even among books of similar size and content, no two were exactly alike. One of the most distinctive of these finishing steps was tooling, the process of pressing heated metal stamps into the leather cover to create patterns, borders, or central motifs. The designs could be simple, consisting of repeated geometric shapes, or complex with interlaced vines, floral motifs, or heraldic symbols that signified the owner's identity or the patron who had commissioned the work. Blind tooling, where the impressions were left uncolored, gave a subtle elegance, while gilded tooling, achieved by applying gold leaf to the impressions before pressing them into the leather, produced a striking shimmer that caught the light. This decorative work required a steady hand, precise heat control, and an understanding of how the leather would respond, for too much heat could scorch it, while too little would leave the design faint. At this stage, the binder might also attach additional protective features, such as metal corner pieces or edge reinforcements, especially for large, heavy books meant for frequent use in monastic libraries or university collections. These fittings prevented wear on the most vulnerable parts of the cover and added an air of dignity to the finished volume. In some cases, especially with religious texts or presentation copies, the decoration became even more elaborate, incorporating jewels, enamel plaques, or ivory carvings set into the covers. While such luxuries were rare, They illustrate how bookbinding in the 1400s could range from purely functional to deeply artistic. Once the exterior was complete, attention might return briefly to the interior. The binder would check that the sewing was still tight and that the spine was properly rounded and backed, a shaping process that allowed the book to open smoothly without breaking its structure. The smoothness of the opening was critical. A book too stiff would be difficult to read, while one too loose could quickly fall apart. When all was in order, the binder would sometimes add a small binder's mark or stamp, an unobtrusive signature hidden on a paste down inside the cover or at the base of the spine to identify the workshop. With this, the bookbinding process reached its conclusion. The finished work was far more than a stack of written pages. It was a complete, harmonious object that balanced durability, function, and beauty. In an age when books were rare and costly, the binder's craftsmanship ensured that each volume could survive generations of use, its covers opening and closing countless times, its pages protected from wear and damage. And so, in the quiet workshops of the 1400s, surrounded by the smell of leather and glue, the sound of wood being planed and thread being pulled through folded sheets, the art of bookbinding carried on, slowly and carefully, one book at a time, preserving not just words, but the dignity of the written word itself. In the workshops of the 1400s, bookbinding was not an isolated craft, but part of a larger ecosystem of trades and skills that worked together to produce a finished volume. And understanding this context reveals just how much care and coordination went into binding a single book. The binder's work began only after the scribe had completed the text, a process that could take weeks or even months depending on the length and complexity of the manuscript. Once the pages were delivered, often in stacks of folded gatherings, the binder might collaborate with illuminators or rubricators, whose job was to add decorative initials, headings, and illustrations before the book was sewn. Timing was crucial. The binder could not begin sewing until all the ink and paint were fully dry, for any moisture could stain or warp the pages during the binding process. When sewing began, the quires were aligned with great precision, each stitch passing through carefully pierced holes along the spine folds, the needle drawing strong linen thread in a methodical sequence that anchored the gatherings to stout cords or bands. These cords formed the structural backbone of the book, and their placement determined how evenly the spine would bear the weight of repeated opening and closing. The wooden boards that would become the covers were cut and shaped to fit these sewn sections exactly, their edges sometimes beveled for a smoother feel and lighter weight. The cords were laced into the boards through channels and pegged or wedged in place, locking the text block firmly to its covers. At this stage, the spine might be rounded and backed, a technique in which the spine was gently hammered into a convex curve and the shoulders of the text block shaped to meet the boards, allowing the book to open more easily while keeping its pages aligned. Before the leather was applied, the boards were sometimes lined with additional layers of paper or parchment to smooth out any irregularities. The leather itself was carefully prepared, soaked to soften it, stretched to remove any imperfections, and trimmed to size with enough excess to wrap neatly over the edges of the boards. Glue, often made from animal hide, was brushed onto the boards and spine, and the leather was pressed into place with deliberate movements, smoothed by hand or with a bone folder, to remove air bubbles and ensure an even adhesion. Every stage was slow and deliberate, each step building upon the last, for a mistake in the early phases could compromise the durability of the entire binding. In this way, the binder's role was both highly technical and quietly artistic, ensuring that the final book was strong enough to survive centuries of use, yet pleasing enough to honor the labor that had gone into its creation. By the time a book in the 1400s reached the stage where its leather covering had been secured over the boards, the binder's work entered a phase of refining and reinforcing the structure, ensuring that every element would function as intended, and that the volume would endure the test of time. The leather, still pliable from being worked and stretched, had to be allowed to dry under controlled conditions so that it would shrink slightly and conform tightly to the shape of the boards, hugging the spine and corners without puckering. Once the leather was set, the binder would often turn attention to adding head caps, small rolled or tucked extensions of the leather at the top and bottom of the spine that served to protect the ends of the binding from wear when the book was pulled from a shelf. Headbands, which had sometimes been sewn earlier in the process, were now integrated more fully into the design, their colored threads providing both a visual accent and additional structural stability to the spine. The inner joints where the boards met the text block were carefully examined. If any gaps were visible, they might be reinforced with strips of parchment or cloth to prevent splitting under strain. At this stage, the binder might also trim and finish the edges of the boards, removing any irregularities and ensuring that the covers opened and closed smoothly without catching against the text. For books intended to be of higher status or ceremonial use, the binder could embellish the covers with decorative tooling, pressing heated stamps into the leather to create borders, central panels, or repeating motifs. These designs were often inspired by patterns seen in manuscripts or architectural ornamentation of the period. And in the case of gilded tooling, gold leaf was applied with painstaking care to the impressions so that they would gleam softly when caught by the light. Clasps and straps were another common addition at this stage. Made of brass, bronze, or iron, and sometimes lined with leather, these fittings were attached to the four edges of the boards with small nails or rivets, allowing the book to be securely closed when not in use. This was especially important for volumes bound in parchment, which could warp in changing humidity if left unrestrained. The inner covers, or paste downs, were usually the final component to be added, serving to conceal the lacing of the cords into the boards and to give the interior a neat, finished appearance. These paste downs could be plain, made from spare sheets of parchment, or they could be more elaborate, featuring decorative papers or even recycled manuscript leaves from older books. The binder would then make a final inspection, flexing the boards gently, opening the book to ensure that the spine moved correctly, and checking that every surface was smooth, tight, and free of defects. Only when every detail met the standard of the workshop was the book considered complete, a fully realized object that combined the written word with the enduring craftsmanship of the binder's art. In the 1400s, once a book had been fully bound and inspected, its journey did not necessarily end at the binder's bench, for many volumes went on to receive additional treatments or customizations that reflected the needs, tastes, and resources of their owners. Some books, especially those intended for wealthy patrons, religious institutions, or universities, were sent to skilled artisans for further ornamentation. These specialists might add intricate blind tooling in repeating geometric or floral patterns across the covers, creating textures that could be both seen and felt under the fingertips. Others would apply gilded designs using gold leaf and finely engraved tools, forming borders, rosettes, or symbolic emblems that shimmered softly in the light of candles or daylight, filtering through narrow windows. The gilding process was delicate, requiring the leather to be lightly moistened so it would accept the gold, then carefully impressed with a heated tool to bind the metal leaf into the surface. Mistakes could not be easily corrected, and so the work was done slowly and with the utmost precision. For books of particularly high value, binders or metalworkers might create protective metalwork for the corners, center, or spine, not only as embellishment, but as reinforcement against wear. These fittings could be plain brass or iron, but in rare cases they were engraved, inlaid with enamel, or even set with semi-precious stones, turning the book into a true luxury object. Clasps were another area where customization flourished. Some were simple hook and eye closures, while others were carefully hinged pieces of engraved brass that clicked shut with satisfying precision, keeping the parchment or vellum pages tightly pressed together. The inside of the covers, too, could be customized. Paste downs might feature hand-painted designs, printed decorative papers, or fragments of illuminated manuscripts recycled from older books, providing both structural function and unexpected visual richness. In monasteries, the binding might include labels or inscriptions on the covers or spines to help identify the contents when the volume was stored on a lectern or in a chest. In academic settings, where books were shared among scholars, chains could be added, attached to a metal fitting on the cover, and securing the book to a reading desk or wall fixture to prevent theft, a common practice in libraries of the era. Even after all these refinements, the book would often spend several days resting before being delivered to its owner, allowing adhesives to cure fully and the materials to settle into their final form. When the volume finally left the binder's workshop, it was more than a vessel for written words. It was an object that embodied the combined skills of scribes, illuminators, and craftsmen, a piece of art and architecture in miniature designed to safeguard its contents for generations. In this way, the act of binding a book in the 1400s was never just a matter of assembly. It was a slow, deliberate process of creation, one that balanced utility and beauty in equal measure, leaving behind artifacts that, centuries later, still carry the quiet dignity of the hands that made them. By the latter half of the 1400s, the art of bookbinding had reached a balance between established tradition and subtle innovation, with techniques refined over centuries and adapted to the materials and demands of the time. The century had begun with books being produced almost entirely by hand, each page written by scribes in careful script on parchment or vellum, and it was ending with the arrival of the printing press, which, while still in its infancy, was beginning to change the way books were made and bound. For the binder, the essential tasks remained much the same, whether the text block was handwritten or printed. Sewing the gatherings onto strong cords, lacing those cords into wooden boards, shaping the spine so that the book would open and close smoothly, covering it in leather, and adding decorative and functional elements. Yet the growing availability of books, thanks to printing, slowly increased the demand for bindings, and in some workshops, efficiency began to matter more than it had in the purely manuscript era. Still, speed could never come at the cost of durability. A poorly bound book would quickly betray its maker, splitting at the joints or losing pages. Many binders maintained the same level of meticulous care that had defined the craft for generations, inspecting every quire for proper alignment, making sure the tension of the sewing was even, and ensuring that the boards fit precisely to the size of the text block. Decorative elements continued to vary widely depending on the purpose and prestige of the book. Religious volumes, especially Bibles, psalters, and books of hours, often received the most elaborate bindings, with blind-tooled or gilded covers, brass clasps, and sometimes even inset panels of ivory or enamel. Academic texts and reference works might be more plainly bound, emphasizing durability over ornamentation. But even these often bore some modest decoration, a reminder that books were still valued objects no matter their use. The tools of the binder's trade, needles, awls, bone folders, paring knives, sewing frames, and heated stamps, were handled with practiced familiarity, each movement refined through repetition. In the workshop, the air carried the mingled scents of leather, wood, glue, and oil, a sensory landscape that would have been instantly recognizable to any binder of the age. Apprentices learned through years of careful instruction, starting with simple tasks like preparing thread or cutting parchment strips, gradually moving on to sewing, shaping, and tooling under the watchful eye of a master. This transmission of knowledge ensured continuity in the craft, so that the skills of one generation became the foundation for the next. Even as printing began to expand the reach of the written word, the binder's role remained essential, for without a strong and well-made binding, no book, no matter how beautifully written or printed, could survive the handling of daily use or the passage of time. In this way, the bookbinders of the 1400s stood as quiet guardians of the knowledge they enclosed, their work turning fragile stacks of parchment or paper into enduring artifacts that could be read, studied, and treasured for centuries. As the 15th century drew toward its end, the craft of bookbinding stood at an intersection between the world of medieval manuscript culture and the emerging age of printed books. And while the content inside was changing in its method of production, the binder's work remained anchored in the traditions that had been refined over generations. In the bustling towns where printing presses had taken hold, Mainz, Venice, Nuremberg, Paris, the binder's workshop often received stacks of freshly printed sheets instead of hand-copied quires. But the process of turning these loose gatherings into a functional, durable book was largely the same as it had been earlier in the century. The printed sheets still had to be folded into gatherings, collated carefully in their correct order, and sewn onto cords or bands with the same even tension that would allow the spine to flex without breaking. The boards, still usually made of oak or beech, were cut to size and laced securely with the sewing supports, and the spine was shaped by hand, rounded and backed so the covers would sit flush against the shoulders of the text block. The leather covering, whether calf, goat, or pigskin, was pared thin at the edges, dampened, and stretched over the boards, then smoothed with a bone folder until it lay perfectly against the surface. Decorative work still held an important place, even for printed books. Blind tooling, which left dark impressions in the leather without color, remained the most common method, but gilded designs were increasingly popular for wealthy clients. reflecting the growing status of printed books as valuable possessions in their own right. Many binders continued to add clasps or straps, understanding that the parchment used in some books could still warp without pressure to hold it closed. In workshops where both manuscript and printed books were bound side by side, there was a visible blending of styles. Printed texts bound in the ornate, jewel-studded covers, once reserved for illuminated manuscripts, and hand-copied works given plainer, sturdier bindings suited to everyday study. The rhythms of the binder's day had not changed much. The sound of thread pulling through folded sheets, the smell of heated glue, the feel of leather under the fingertips, the quiet focus required to align each element so the book would function perfectly for decades, perhaps centuries. Apprentices still learned by observation and repetition, starting with simple repairs, moving on to sewing, and eventually to the full binding process under the guidance of a master. This transmission of skill ensured that the knowledge of how to bind a book to last was not lost, even as the materials and the flow of work began to shift with the spread of printing. In this way, the end of the 1400s was not a moment of abrupt change for the binder, but rather a slow turning of the page, one where the core values of durability, beauty, and precision remained intact, carrying the craft forward into a new century where books would become more numerous, yet still in need of the patient hands that could transform them into enduring works of art. By the closing years of the 15th century, the bookbinder's craft had become a bridge between two worlds, the age-old tradition of handcrafted manuscripts and the rapidly expanding era of printed books. And while the printing press was transforming the speed at which words could be multiplied, it had little effect on the slow, deliberate nature of the binding process itself. In workshops across Europe, the workbench still held the same familiar tools: the sewing frame, the awl, the paring knife, the bone folder, the heated stamps for tooling. Whether binding a precious illuminated manuscript for a wealthy patron or a printed volume destined for a scholar's study, the binder's methods remained anchored in practices perfected over centuries. Printed sheets, though uniform in size and type, still had to be folded carefully into gatherings, collated in precise order, and sewn onto cords or bands with tight, even stitching. The wooden boards, still most often cut from oak, beech, or other sturdy hardwood, were shaped to match the text block exactly, their inner edges beveled to reduce bulk and allow the book to close neatly. The cords were laced through channels cut into the boards and pegged or wedged in place, creating a strong, durable structure. The spine was gently rounded and backed with a hammer, forming shoulders that would support the boards and protect the sewing. Once covered in leather, the boards were pressed tightly to the text block, the leather smoothed and stretched until it lay snug and flawless. Even for printed books, decorative tooling remained common, with blind-tooled patterns forming frames, central medallions, or repeating geometric designs. Gilding was still reserved for more expensive commissions, but as the century ended, it became slightly more common among the wealthier merchant classes, who could now afford to own books in greater numbers. Clasps and straps continued to be fitted, both to preserve the shape of parchment leaves and to protect the paper of printed books from curling in humid conditions. Inside, paste downs concealed the lacing of the cords and provided a clean, finished appearance, sometimes made from recycled manuscript leaves, whose text and decoration peeked faintly from behind their new purpose. The arrival of printing also influenced the speed and volume of work in some workshops, requiring binders to adapt to a steadier flow of commissions while still maintaining the durability and beauty that had long defined the trade. Apprentices were kept busy with preparatory tasks, paring leather, cutting boards, threading needles, while the master binder focused on the most critical steps of sewing, covering, and finishing. Despite the larger scale of book production, each binding was still an individual creation, its slight variations reflecting the hand and judgment of its maker. In this way, even as books became more common, the act of binding them remained deeply personal, each volume carrying the quiet signature of the craftsman who had shaped it into a form that could endure centuries. As the 16th century approached, the work of the 1400s bookbinder stood as a testament to the enduring value of skill, patience, and tradition. For even with the growing influence of the printing press, the process of turning loose sheets into a complete book remained a slow, deliberate craft that had changed little in its essentials over the centuries. The binder still began with gatherings carefully collated in perfect order, sewn tightly onto cords or bands with strong linen thread, each stitch pulled with the same care as those made. In the time of the earliest bound manuscripts, the wooden boards were still cut and shaped to fit the text block exactly, their edges beveled, their channels cut to receive the laced-in sewing supports. The spine was still rounded and backed to ensure the book would open smoothly and close firmly, and the leather, calf, goat, or pigskin was pared, dampened, stretched, and smoothed into place until it lay like a second skin over the wood. Decorative tooling, whether blind or gilded, still marked the covers, each impression a record of the craftsman's hand and the traditions of his workshop. Clasps and fittings continued to serve both functional and ornamental roles, protecting the pages and signaling the value of the contents within. Inside, paste downs finished the binding with neatness, concealing the structural work while adding stability to the boards. Though printing was increasing the number of books in circulation, each volume was still a physical object shaped by human judgment and touch, no two exactly alike. The binder's workshop remained a place where the pace of work was dictated not by machines, but by the natural rhythms of the craft. The drying of glue, the setting of leather, the careful alignment of each element. Apprentices still learned by years of practice under the eye of a master, absorbing not only the steps of the process, but the feel of the materials, the subtle signs that told when a spine was correctly rounded, when leather was ready to be tooled, when a clasp was perfectly aligned. Even as the new century promised faster production and broader access to the written word, the bindings of the 1400s retained their place as lasting works of art and engineering, capable of surviving centuries if treated with care. Many of these volumes still exist today, their leather darkened and softened with age, their boards firm, their sewing intact, carrying within them the labor of craftsmen whose names are long forgotten, but whose skill remains evident in every turn of the page. In the quiet of libraries, archives, and private collections, these bindings continue to do their work, holding together the words and knowledge of a past age, reminding us that the act of binding a book in the 1400s was not simply a trade, but a careful meeting of utility and beauty, made to serve both the moment and the centuries to come. That brings us to the end of our previous story. Before we drift into the next one, I'd be so grateful if you could give this video a gentle like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep bringing you these calm, quiet journeys through history. Now, let's settle in once more. Let your breathing slow, keep the volume soft, and allow your mind to rest. As we continue with the next story in our Boring History for Sleep series. The Stonecutters of Gothic Cathedrals. In the heart of medieval Europe, when the great Gothic cathedrals began to rise against the skyline with their towering spires and intricate facades, the stonecutters were among the quiet artisans whose work gave shape to these monumental structures. Their craft was slow, deliberate, and deeply rooted in knowledge passed down through generations. For the stone that formed the walls, columns, and arches of a cathedral could not simply be taken from the earth and set in place. It had to be carefully chosen, shaped, and finished, so that it would bear the immense weight of the structure for centuries. The process began long before the first stone was laid on the building site. Quarries were identified for the quality and durability of their stone, often limestone, sandstone, or granite, each with its own working qualities and challenges. The extraction was laborious, using iron tools like chisels, picks, and wedges, along with wooden levers and hammers to loosen massive blocks from the quarry face. Once freed, the blocks were roughly squared and marked before being loaded onto carts or barges for transport to the construction site, a journey that could take days or weeks, depending on the distance. When the stone arrived at the cathedral works, the stonecutters' role truly began. Working at a mason's yard near the site, they used a combination of mallets, chisels, and specialized tools like point chisels, tooth chisels, and claw tools to gradually bring each block to its required dimensions. The precision was not only functional, but also artistic, for Gothic cathedrals demanded more than simple squared blocks. They required curved arches, fluted columns, elaborate tracery for windows, and intricate carvings of foliage, saints, and biblical scenes. Each piece was shaped according to detailed templates prepared by the master mason, whose design translated the vision of the cathedral into exact measurements and angles. For the stonecutter, accuracy was everything. Too much removed from a block, and it could not be repaired. Too little, and it would not fit into the precise geometry of the building. The sound of their work was constant in the yard, the rhythmic tapping and sharper strikes of metal on stone, accompanied by the occasional scrape as a surface was smoothed or an edge refined. Dust hung in the air, settling on hair, skin, and clothing, a fine layer that clung to the stonecutters as a mark of their trade. This work was not hurried. It was paced to the rhythm of the building itself, for a Gothic cathedral was a project that could span decades, even centuries, and the quality of each stone determined the strength of the whole. Apprentices learned the craft by observing and imitating the motions of experienced cutters, starting with simple shapes before moving on to more complex curves and decorative forms. The stones they shaped would be hoisted high into the walls, arches, and vaults, their placement guided by teams of masons above. And once set, their work became part of the cathedral's enduring fabric, unseen by most who would one day stand in awe of the finished building, yet essential to its beauty and stability. At the bustling construction yards of a Gothic cathedral, the stonecutters' daily work unfolded in a space that was part workshop, part open-air classroom, and part community. For these men labored side by side for years, sometimes decades, on the same monumental project. The yard itself was usually set close to the building site, so that completed stones could be moved efficiently to where they were needed, yet far enough away to reduce the noise and dust around the cathedral's foundations. Here, long wooden trestles held blocks of varying sizes, some as large as a man's chest, others delicate fragments destined for tracery or sculpted detail. Each stone was assigned a specific place in the cathedral's design, and before any cutting began, the master mason or one of his assistants would mark the block with lines and symbols, sometimes using chalk, charcoal, or red ochre to guide the work. Stonecutters relied on an array of tools, each suited to a particular stage of shaping. Point chisels were used to rough out the general form, their sharp tips biting into the stone with firm, deliberate blows from a wooden or metal mallet. Tooth chisels, with their comb-like edges, followed to refine the surface, breaking away smaller chips and smoothing the ridges left by the point chisel. Claw tools, flat chisels, and rasps were used for finer finishing, especially on pieces that would be visible to the eye once set in place. For the most intricate decorative elements, carved leaves curling from a capital, the serene face of a saint, or the delicate patterns of a window tracery, stonecutters might spend days or even weeks on a single block, working slowly to preserve the integrity of the stone while achieving the precise depth and detail required. Dust was a constant presence, coating the air and the skin, and many stonecutters wore simple cloths over their mouths or dampened them to keep from breathing in too much grit, though such measures were often inconsistent in practice. The rhythm of work was steady, unhurried, and dictated by the pace of the cathedral's progress. Some stones would be needed immediately to continue a rising wall, while others were prepared well in advance for future phases of construction. Apprentices assisted by fetching tools, turning heavy blocks, and practicing on offcuts, gradually building the strength and precision needed for the craft. Communication was often a mixture of shouted words, hand signals, and the shared understanding that came from long collaboration. And though much of the stonecutters' work would be hidden from view behind layers of masonry or placed high in the vaults beyond the reach of human touch, there was pride in knowing that each piece, no matter how humble, was part of a structure meant to endure for centuries. This awareness gave their labor a quiet dignity, a sense that the marks they carved into the stone were not only shaping a building, but also shaping history itself. The stonecutters' role in the creation of a Gothic cathedral was not confined solely to shaping stone. It was interwoven with the efforts of numerous other skilled trades, each dependent on the precision and reliability of the others, creating a complex web of collaboration that spanned years and often decades. The master mason served as both architect and project manager, translating the overall design into detailed templates for the stonecutters and ensuring that every piece fitted perfectly within the vast geometry of the structure. Carpenters were responsible for building the wooden scaffolding that allowed masons to work high above the ground, as well as crafting the centering frames that supported arches until the keystones were set in place. Blacksmiths forged the chisels, mallets, and other tools the stonecutters used daily, adjusting and repairing them as wear dulled their edges. Laborers moved the heavy blocks from the mason's yard to the building site, sometimes with the aid of wooden cranes, pulleys, and windlasses operated by teams of men walking inside great wooden wheels. In this environment, the stonecutters had to maintain not only accuracy in their work, but also a keen awareness of timing. A delay in producing a critical piece could halt progress on an entire section of the cathedral. The pace of construction was also shaped by the rhythms of the year. Winter cold could make stone brittle and difficult to work, while summer heat demanded steady hydration for the laborers, and all seasons brought the challenge of weather on the open scaffolds. Life for a stonecutter was demanding, with long hours spent in physical labor, yet the work also carried a sense of belonging to something far greater than any individual. Meals were often taken together in the yard, simple fare of bread, cheese, and ale, shared among the workers in the brief respite between sessions of cutting and measuring. Bonds formed between men who labored side by side for years, and apprentices were not only trained in the technical aspects of the craft, but also absorbed the discipline, patience, and pride that defined the profession. Though they worked with their hands, the stonecutters were not regarded as mere laborers. They were craftsmen, part of a respected guild that ensured standards were maintained and that members were looked after in times of injury or need. Their wages were modest but steady, and the security of working on a project that could span decades meant that many remained tied to a single cathedral for much of their careers. Even when the work was repetitive, there was satisfaction in seeing the walls climb higher, the vaults take shape, and the spires reach toward the sky, knowing that each precisely cut block was a necessary part of that upward journey. And when the day's work was done, the tools carefully stored, and the dust brushed from clothing and skin, the stonecutters could look upon the rising cathedral and recognize in its growing silhouette the enduring mark of their own skill and labor. The techniques employed by stonecutters during the construction of Gothic cathedrals were the product of generations of refinement, blending practical necessity with a level of artistry that made their work both durable and beautiful. Every block of stone, no matter its eventual position in the structure, was approached with the same discipline, beginning with careful measurement against templates prepared by the master mason. These templates, often made from thin boards or stiff parchment, bore the exact profile of the intended piece, whether it was a simple rectangular ashlar for the wall or a complex voussoir for an arch. Using a square, straight edge, and compasses, the stonecutter would transfer these dimensions onto the raw block, marking reference lines that would guide each strike of the chisel. The initial roughing out stage required the most force, with a point chisel used to remove large amounts of stone quickly while still staying well outside the final line to avoid accidental overcutting. Once the general shape emerged, the tooth chisel and claw tool came into play, their serrated edges biting away finer layers and bringing the surface closer to its intended form. For decorative elements, such as the curling leaves of a capital or the delicate tracery of a rose window, the pace slowed dramatically, each cut made with precision to preserve the integrity of the design. The final smoothing was done with flat chisels and abrasive stones, leaving a finish that could range from finely polished to subtly textured depending on its position in the building and the desired effect. Safety, though not formalized as it is today, was a constant concern, for the work carried risks from falling blocks, tool slips, and long-term exposure to stone dust. Scaffolds and platforms were built sturdy but could sway in strong winds, and stonecutters working aloft had to keep a sure footing while shaping or fitting stones high above the ground. In the yard, blocks weighing hundreds of pounds were shifted with wooden levers, rollers, and cranes, requiring coordination to avoid injury. Despite these dangers, the craftsmen took pride in their resilience and in the physical strength their work demanded. Yet it was not merely muscle that defined their skill, it was an understanding of the stone itself, how it would respond to the chisel, how its grain might dictate the direction of a cut, and how each piece needed to interlock with its neighbors to create a structure that would endure for centuries. This marriage of strength, precision, and knowledge was what allowed Gothic cathedrals to achieve their soaring heights and intricate details without sacrificing stability. And for the stonecutter, each completed piece, whether hidden deep within the wall or displayed in the open glory of the facade, was a quiet testament to the craft, a contribution to a structure that would stand long after the hands that shaped it had turned to dust. Balancing speed and precision was one of the most enduring challenges faced by the stonecutters who labored on Gothic cathedrals, For the sheer scale of these projects meant that progress had to be steady if the walls, arches, and towers were to rise within a generation, yet the quality of each individual stone could not be compromised without risking the strength of the whole structure. A cathedral might take 50 years or more to complete, sometimes spanning the careers of 2 or 3 master masons and multiple generations of craftsmen. And so the work was organized in a way that allowed for continuous advancement while maintaining the meticulous standards the architecture demanded. The master mason would break the cathedral's design into phases, assigning sections of wall, vaulting, or decorative stonework to different teams, each with its own foreman who ensured that measurements, profiles, and finishes matched the master's specifications. In the stone yard, blocks destined for hidden structural positions could be prepared more quickly, with surfaces left rough where they would be concealed within the walls, while those intended for visible facades, columns, or tracery were given far more attention, their edges and details refined, until they met the exacting demands of Gothic ornamentation. This careful division of labor allowed the project to move forward at multiple points simultaneously. While one crew cut ashlar blocks for the rising nave walls, another might be shaping the elaborate ribs for vaulting that would not be installed until years later. Yet even the quick work required a disciplined hand, for any deviation in size or angle could throw off the alignment of the structure. Communication between teams was constant, often relying on physical templates that could be passed from the drawing loft to the yard and then to the masons on the scaffold, ensuring consistency across the entire building. The pace of progress also depended on external factors. Weather could halt quarrying or transport. Shortages of skilled labor could slow production, and funding, often provided by patrons, church officials, or donations from the community, could ebb and flow over the decades. In times of financial strain, stonecutters might be kept on reduced hours or shifted to maintenance work on completed sections until full-scale construction could resume. Despite these challenges, the men took pride in the steady accumulation of progress, knowing that every block they shaped brought the cathedral a little closer to completion. For them, the balance between speed and precision was not a compromise, but a craft in itself, a learned rhythm of labor that kept the work moving forward without losing the integrity that would allow the building to stand for centuries. And in the quiet moments, as they stepped back to inspect a finished piece or watched it hoisted high into place, they could see their own contribution taking its place in the great tapestry of stone, where every block, no matter how quickly or slowly it was cut, became an essential part of the cathedral's enduring form. For the stonecutters of Gothic cathedrals, their craftsmanship carried a weight that went beyond the practical demands of building a structure to last for centuries. It was also bound up in the symbolic meaning of the cathedral itself, a meaning that infused their daily labor with a quiet sense of purpose. A Gothic cathedral was not merely a large building. It was a physical representation of faith, a monument to the glory of God, and a gathering place for an entire community, and every block of stone contributed to that vision. The master mason's designs were not only technical blueprints, but theological statements rendered in geometry and proportion, and the stonecutter's hands were the ones that transformed those ideas into tangible form. When carving capitals adorned with leaves and flowers, they echoed the richness of creation. When shaping the pointed arches and ribbed vaults, they gave form to the aspiration of reaching heavenward. Even the most utilitarian blocks, hidden deep within the walls, played a role in supporting the visible splendor above, much as unseen acts of devotion upheld the public life of the church. Many stonecutters were deeply aware of this symbolism, and while their work was rooted in precision and craft, it also carried an element of offering, a contribution made in stone rather than coin. The rhythms of their labor often coincided with the rhythms of the liturgical year. Feast days might bring processions that passed by the rising structure, blessing the work and those who toiled on it, and major milestones in construction, such as the setting of a keystone or the completion of a spire, were marked by ceremonies attended by clergy, patrons, and townspeople. In these moments, the stonecutters stood among the crowd, knowing that the work of their hands would outlast them by generations. This sense of permanence was part of the unspoken bond between the craftsmen and the building. They knew they were shaping something they would never see completed in its entirety, yet they trusted that their contribution would be carried forward by others. The guild system reinforced this sense of continuity, linking each craftsman to a lineage of skill and tradition that stretched back centuries. Instruction was passed from master to apprentice, not only through demonstration of technique, but also through the transmission of values. Patience, accuracy, humility before the scale of the task, and pride in work well done. In the quiet moments at the mason's bench or high on the scaffold, a stonecutter might pause to look over the worksite, the ordered chaos of blocks, tools, cranes, and scaffolds, and see in it the living embodiment of a shared purpose, where individual labor became part of a greater whole. And when the day's work ended, the cathedral still rose a little higher against the sky, each stone a testament to the union of skill, faith, and enduring human effort that defined the Gothic age. The daily routines of stonecutters working on Gothic cathedrals were shaped as much by the cycles of the seasons and the realities of medieval life as by the demands of the building itself, creating a rhythm of existence that intertwined labor, community, and the simple necessities of survival. A typical day began at first light, when the workers made their way to the mason's yard or up the scaffolding, tools slung over shoulders or carried in simple leather rolls. The air in the early hours was cool and still, a quiet moment before the sharp ring of chisel on stone filled the space. Work continued steadily through the morning, punctuated by the measured calls of foremen and the occasional shout between crews, moving large blocks into place. Meals were taken quickly and without ceremony, bread, cheese, and ale or small beer, sometimes supplemented by onions, dried fish, or a bit of salted meat, all eaten in the shade of the yard's wooden sheds or perched on low walls. The afternoons were often the most grueling, especially in summer when the heat could make the stone warm to the touch and the dust hang heavy in the air, clinging to skin and clothing. In winter, the challenges shifted. Numb fingers, stiff from the cold, struggled to keep the precision needed for fine cuts, and daylight was precious, work ending earlier before the dimness made accuracy impossible. Outside of the workday, stonecutters lived modestly, often in small houses or rented rooms near the construction site, sharing space with their families or fellow craftsmen. The cathedral project itself provided a degree of stability rare in medieval trades, for a building of such magnitude promised years of continuous employment, and this allowed stonecutters to establish roots in the community. They were part of the fabric of the town's life, attending church services, contributing to guild activities, and participating in local festivals and markets. Apprentices often lived with their masters, absorbing not only the skills of the craft, but also the habits and discipline required to sustain a lifetime of such work. Social ties among the workers were strong, forged through long hours side by side, and the shared knowledge that each person's efforts supported the others. Disputes did occur over wages, conditions, or the quality of a particular piece, but these were typically resolved within the guild or under the guidance of the master mason, for harmony on the worksite was essential to progress. The pace of construction was a constant reminder of the long view. No single worker could hope to see the entire cathedral completed from foundation to spire, yet each knew his role was vital to the generations that would follow. In the evenings, the sounds of work gave way to the hum of domestic life, children playing in the narrow streets, the smells of cooking drifting from hearths, and the low murmur of conversation in taverns where men gathered to rest their bodies and exchange news. It was a life of steady labor, marked by the satisfaction of contributing to a creation that would stand for centuries. And though the stonecutters might never sign their names upon their work, their lives were indelibly written in the enduring walls of the cathedral itself. The training of a stonecutter in the Gothic era was not a short or simple undertaking, but rather a carefully structured journey that blended observation, repetition, and gradual responsibility. A process designed to instill not only the physical skills of the craft, but also the patience, discipline, and attention to detail that defined the best in the trade. Young apprentices, often boys in their early teens, began their days not at the heart of the worksite, but on its edges, sweeping away stone chips, carrying tools to senior masons, and fetching water or lime as needed. At first, their tasks seemed menial, but these duties allowed them to study the movements of experienced craftsmen up close, to hear the different sounds a chisel made when striking various types of stone, and to learn the subtle differences between limestone from one quarry and sandstone from another. Gradually, they were given small blocks to work on, often discarded offcuts, where they could practice straight cuts, then curves, then more intricate shapes. The master mason or a trusted journeyman would check their progress, pointing out where the chisel angle was too steep or the pressure uneven, and sending them back to try again until the cut was true. This methodical repetition might continue for years before an apprentice was trusted with a piece destined for the cathedral itself. Alongside these physical skills, apprentices absorbed the unwritten rules of the workshop: how to respect the chain of command, how to maintain tools so they stayed sharp, and how to read the plans and templates that guided the shaping of each block. Many learned to mix and apply mortar, to understand the balance between structural strength and aesthetic beauty, and to calculate measurements so that each stone fit precisely into place. The training extended beyond the yard. Apprentices often lived under the roof of their master, sharing meals and chores, learning the rhythms of the trade as part of daily life. Discipline was enforced not with formal schooling, but through the natural demands of the work. Carelessness could waste valuable stone, delay progress, or even endanger lives on the scaffold. Over the years, as an apprentice's skill grew, so too did his responsibilities, from roughing out larger stones to carving decorative moldings, then perhaps sculpting the tracery for a window, or the delicate foliate patterns that adorn doorways and capitals. By the time he was ready to present his masterpiece, the work that would mark his transition from apprentice to journeyman, he had not only mastered the use of chisel and mallet, but had developed the eye for symmetry, the steady hand, and the instinct for stone that could not be taught in words alone. The guilds oversaw this process, ensuring that the standards of the craft were upheld, and that knowledge was passed from one generation to the next without dilution. In this way, the cathedral's stones carried not only the marks of the men who shaped them, but also the echoes of countless lessons learned in the quiet patience of the workshop. Lessons that linked each new mason to a tradition centuries old, a living chain of skill and care that ensured the grandeur of the Gothic cathedral would endure long after its builders were gone. The guild system in the Gothic era served as both the backbone and the safeguard of the stone-cutting profession, functioning not merely as an administrative body, but as a living network that preserved tradition, enforced standards, and ensured that every block of stone placed in a cathedral wall reflected the accumulated skill and discipline of generations of masons. Membership in the guild was not simply a matter of signing a register. It was the culmination of years of apprenticeship, testing, and moral evaluation, for the guild was as concerned with the character of its members as with their technical ability. At its core, the guild acted as a guardian of quality, setting out the methods and measurements that defined proper work, from the way a block was squared to the depth and precision of ornamental carving. If a journeyman submitted work that fell short, it was rejected outright, sometimes at his own expense, to protect the integrity of the building and the reputation of the craft. The guild also regulated who could work where, controlling entry into the profession to prevent an oversupply of untrained laborers that could drive down wages and standards. In many towns, only those who belonged to the guild could legally work on large-scale projects such as a cathedral, and each mason was required to mark his finished stones with a distinctive mason's mark, a small carved symbol that identified the individual responsible. These marks were more than signatures. They were a visible record of accountability, allowing faulty work to be traced back to its source, but also enabling a master's best work to earn him recognition and new commissions. Beyond the worksite, the guild acted as a social and economic safety net for its members, collecting dues that could be used to support a mason injured on the job, to aid the family of one who had died, or to help a journeyman travel to another city in search of work. The guild also played a ceremonial role in the life of the community, participating in religious festivals, processions, and the blessing of new building phases, its members marching in orderly ranks behind banners, embroidered with the tools of their trade, compasses, squares, and mallets. Meetings were held in the guild hall, often a substantial building in its own right, where decisions about work assignments, wages, and disputes were made, and where younger members could hear the older masters recount stories of projects long completed, of design challenges overcome, and of the lessons each job had taught. Discipline within the guild was firm but fair. A mason who cheated on measurements, used substandard stone, or undermined a fellow member could face fines, suspension, or even expulsion, a penalty that often meant the end of his career. In this way, the guild not only preserved the high quality of Gothic masonry, but also instilled a sense of pride and belonging among its members, binding them together in a fraternity that valued skill, honor, and the enduring beauty of their shared work. The result was that the great cathedrals rising across Europe in the Middle Ages were not the product of chance or unregulated effort, but the outcome of a carefully maintained system in which every stone was shaped, placed, and finished under the watchful eye of both the master mason on site and the collective wisdom of the guild, ensuring that the buildings they raised would stand for centuries as monuments not only to faith and artistry, but also to the disciplined cooperation of men bound by a common craft. Daily life for the stonecutters working on a Gothic cathedral was a rhythm shaped by the seasons, the rising and setting of the sun, and the unchanging demands of the craft. A pattern of repetition and gradual progress that could stretch across decades, sometimes outlasting the lives of those who labored on it. At dawn, the masons would gather in the shadow of the growing structure, their breath visible in the cool morning air during the colder months. Their tools laid out on wooden benches or spread on canvas sheets to keep them from dampening in the dew. The foreman, often an experienced master mason with decades of work behind him, would assign tasks for the day, shaping blocks, carving decorative details, or setting stones in place high upon the scaffolding. And each man would set about his work with a quiet focus, the sound of chisels striking stone soon filling the air with a steady rhythm, like the heartbeat of the site. Meals were simple and eaten quickly, usually bread, cheese, and perhaps a bit of salted meat or dried fruit, taken in the company of fellow workers seated on the low walls or overturned buckets, where conversations flowed easily about family news, weather, or the latest progress on the structure. While the work was physically demanding and sometimes dangerous, there was a strong sense of camaraderie among the masons, born from the shared experience of long hours, heavy labor, and mutual reliance in a hazardous environment. Trust was essential, for a man on the scaffolding depended on those below to hoist his materials securely, and those below trusted the men above to handle heavy stones with care. Injuries were not uncommon, and when they occurred, the worksite would pause just long enough to ensure the injured man was taken to safety, his tasks often taken over by others until he could return, a silent but powerful demonstration of solidarity. As the day progressed, the sun would shift across the sky, casting new patterns of light and shadow across the unfinished walls, and the masons would adapt their positions to work with the changing light, often adjusting their chiseling angle to better see the fine lines of a carved detail. The air would be filled with the mingled scents of fresh-cut stone, dust, and the faint tang of lime from mortar, while overhead, the unfinished arches and towers framed patches of blue sky or passing clouds. As evening drew near, the tools would be cleaned and stored in locked chests or tool houses to prevent theft or weather damage, and the workers would make their way home through narrow medieval streets, their bodies tired, but their spirits often lifted by the visible progress made that day. A new course of stone laid, a completed carving fitted into its niche, or a wall rising another few feet toward the heavens. In taverns or family kitchens, stories of the day's work would mingle with laughter, and for many, there was quiet satisfaction in knowing that the stone they had shaped or set would remain in place long after they were gone, perhaps for centuries, as part of a building that might still inspire awe in people not yet born. For the masons, this was more than employment. It was a contribution to something enduring, a kind of immortality carved in limestone and granite, where each chisel mark was both a trace of the hand that made it and a small part of a much larger vision. And so the next morning, they would rise again, take up their tools, and return to the cathedral, ready to add another day's labor to a project that had no hurry, for in the world of stone, time moved slowly, and beauty was worth the patience it demanded. Thank you for spending this quiet time with us. We hope this story has brought you calm and rest. Wishing you peaceful nights ahead, and we look forward to sharing more with you here on Sleep Whisper. See you in the next video.